The nights in the barracks were cold, the air thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and iron. Uriah lay awake on his cot, staring at the wooden beams above him, listening to the quiet breathing of the men around him. The war drums had ceased for now, but battle was never far away. The scent of blood clung to his skin no matter how many times he washed. The dirt beneath his nails never truly faded. This was the life of a soldier. The tents were sturdy, but they were not home. The ground beneath them was dry and uneven, and the wind howled through the open spaces, bringing with it the sounds of distant cries, the voices of the wounded, the whispers of those who would not live to see another sunrise. Sleep came in brief moments, stolen between night watches and the anticipation of the next fight. For years, Uriah had lived this way. A man of war, a man of honor, a man whose life was given in service to the king and the God of Israel. He had seen countless battles, had fought alongside the bravest of men, had watched friends fall beside him only to press forward without hesitation, because hesitation meant death. And Uriah was not afraid to die. But what he feared, what kept him awake even in the quiet, was the thought of never returning to Bathsheba. He had left her behind too many times. Every farewell weighed heavier than the last. Every promise to return felt thinner, like a thread that could snap with one wrong move in battle. She deserved more. She deserved a husband who could stay, a man who could wake beside her each morning, who could build a life with her rather than leaving her with only memories. But his duty came first, and duty had called him to war. The letter arrived at dusk, carried by a young servant, his expression unreadable. Uriah wiped the grime from his face and took the scroll, breaking the seal with careful fingers. His name was written in bold strokes, and beneath it, words that made his blood run cold. "Come to Jerusalem at once. The king has summoned you." Uriah frowned. The king. David had never called him back from the battlefield before. Had something happened? Had they lost ground? Had the enemy pressed forward? Or was Bathsheba in danger? His chest tightened at the thought. He stood abruptly, gripping the letter in his fist. "Joab!" he called, his voice steady despite the unease building inside him. The general turned, his expression unreadable. "The king has called for me. I leave at first light." Joab studied him for a moment before nodding. "Be swift, Uriah. And be careful." Uriah didn't understand the warning, but deep in his soul he felt something shifting, something unseen, something waiting for him in Jerusalem. And he had no idea that this journey home would be his last. Uriah's horse moved steadily along the dirt path leading toward the gates of Jerusalem. The city walls rose in the distance, familiar yet distant, like an old friend he had not seen in years. It had only been months, but war had a way of stretching time, of making days feel like lifetimes. His body was weary from the journey, but his mind was restless. The king's summons still burned in his thoughts. Why had David called him away from battle? There had been no signs of retreat, no warnings of failure. And though he had not received a letter from Bathsheba, his heart whispered that something had changed. As he approached the palace gates, the guards stepped aside without question. He was a known man here, one of David's mighty warriors, a soldier of honor and loyalty. And yet, something felt different. The air inside the palace was cooler than the desert heat outside, but Uriah could still feel the weight of expectation pressing against his chest as he walked through the long stone corridors. At last, he reached the great hall. The doors were open before him, and he stepped inside. There, seated on his throne, was David. Uriah dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "My lord, you summoned me." David studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Rise, Uriah." Uriah stood, meeting the king's gaze. David looked different. There was something unreadable in his eyes, a flicker of unease, of something deeper than the usual authority he carried. "How goes the war?" David asked, his voice even. "Strong, my lord. Joab presses forward. The Ammonites grow weaker by the day." David nodded slowly, as if considering this. "And you, Uriah?" he continued, leaning forward slightly. "You have fought hard. You must be weary." Uriah frowned slightly. "I fight as I always have, my king. I will rest when the battle is won." David smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You have been away for too long. You should go home. Be with your wife. Rest in your own house." Uriah blinked. His home? Bathsheba. A sudden rush of longing filled him at the thought of her warmth, her voice, the way she smiled when she saw him. But something about David's words felt off. Why was the king so insistent? Why call him away from war only to send him home? Had Bathsheba sent word to the palace? Was she unwell? His pulse quickened, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "My lord, the Ark of the Covenant remains in a tent. My fellow soldiers sleep on the battlefield, with no roof over their heads. How can I go to my home, eat, drink, and lie with my wife while my brothers fight?" David's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air. There was a pause, a silence that stretched too long. Then the king let out a slow breath and nodded. "You are a man of great honor, Uriah," he said, his voice smooth, measured. Uriah bowed. "It is my duty, my lord." David rose from his throne, stepping down toward him. "Then stay here another night," he said. "At least let me offer you a meal before you return to Joab." Uriah hesitated. He did not wish to delay. The battlefield called to him, but this was his king, and a request from the king was not easily refused. "As you wish, my lord." That night, Uriah sat at the royal table. Wine flowed freely. Servants moved about, filling cups and offering plates of roasted lamb, figs, and warm bread. David sat across from him, speaking of war, of victories, of old battles fought side by side, and yet Uriah could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an unease in the king's voice, a forced cheerfulness, an eagerness that did not belong to a man truly at ease. And the wine. David poured more and more, encouraging Uriah to drink, to loosen his mind, to relax. "Come, Uriah," David said with a smile. "Enjoy yourself. You have earned it." Uriah lifted the cup to his lips, but drank little. A soldier did not dull his senses, and tonight he felt he needed them more than ever. When the meal was done, David clapped him on the shoulder. "Go home, Uriah," he urged again. "Be with your wife. You deserve that much." Uriah bowed deeply. "With all respect, my lord, I will sleep among your servants tonight." David's fingers tensed briefly against his shoulder, so brief, so subtle, Uriah almost missed it. "You are a faithful man, Uriah," David murmured. "The Lord will reward you for it." Uriah nodded. "And he will reward my king as well." He turned and stepped out into the cool night air. He had made his choice, and somehow, deep inside, he felt that it had changed something. Uriah sat outside the palace, the night air cool against his skin, his back resting against the stone wall near the servants' quarters. His body longed for sleep, but his mind was restless. The night before, he had refused the king's invitation to return home, choosing instead to sleep among the king's guards as a soldier should. And now, the same invitation had come again. David had summoned him that morning, pressing him with kindness, offering him another feast, pouring him cup after cup of wine. "Drink, Uriah," the king had said, lifting his own goblet with a grin. "You fight harder than most men in Israel. You have earned a night of rest." The wine had been rich, heavy with spices. It burned in Uriah's throat, warming his stomach. He had allowed himself a few drinks, but he knew what the king was doing. David was trying to send him home, trying to send him to Bathsheba, and Uriah did not understand why. It made no sense, calling him from war, offering him wine, urging him to leave. Why was the king so concerned with his rest? Why now? Unless there was something he was not being told. As dawn approached, Uriah remained outside, his arms crossed over his chest. The sounds of the city waking up filled the air, merchants preparing their stalls, women carrying water from the wells, children laughing in the streets. But inside the palace, secrets were being kept. He did not know what they were, but he could feel them. The doors to the palace opened, and a messenger stepped out, his eyes scanning the courtyard until they landed on Uriah. "The king wishes to see you," the man said. Uriah stood, brushing the dust from his tunic. He followed the messenger through the corridors, his boots echoing against the stone floor. When he entered the throne room, David was already standing, waiting for him. "Uriah," the king said, his tone smooth, too smooth. "My lord," Uriah answered, bowing. David studied him for a long moment before exhaling. "You did not go home last night." Uriah kept his face steady. "No, my lord. I slept among your servants, as my fellow soldiers are still in battle." David nodded slowly, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You are a man of great honor," he said. Uriah did not reply. David stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I will not keep you here any longer. You are to return to Joab at once." A sense of relief filled Uriah's chest. "Thank you, my king," he said, bowing again. David turned, walking toward his desk. "I have written a letter for Joab," he said, lifting a sealed scroll. "Take it to him personally." Uriah stepped forward, taking the letter from the king's hands. "Ride swiftly," David added. "The battle still needs you." Uriah pressed his fist to his chest in a salute. "As you command, my lord." He turned and left the palace, feeling the weight of the scroll in his hands, a direct order from the king. It was an honor to carry such a message, but as Uriah mounted his horse and began the long ride back to battle, he did not know that the letter in his hands was his own death sentence. The wind whipped against Uriah's face as he rode toward the battlefield, the king's letter secured tightly against his chest. He did not read it. He did not question it. His duty was to obey. And yet, as the familiar landscape of the war camp came into view, an unsettling feeling twisted in his gut. David had been eager, too eager, to send him back. The king had been restless, pressing him to return home, urging him to sleep in his own bed, to be with Bathsheba. Why? Why had David cared so much? And why, after 2 failed attempts to send him home, had he suddenly dismissed him with such urgency? He tightened his grip on the reins, forcing the doubts from his mind. His duty was not to question. He was a soldier. He was a man of honor. And a man of honor delivered the king's message without hesitation. As soon as he reached the camp, Uriah dismounted and made his way to Joab's tent. The general was standing over a war map, his expression hard with focus. Joab looked up as Uriah entered. "You return quickly," Joab said. "The king has sent me back," Uriah replied, pulling the sealed letter from his belt. "For you." Joab took the scroll, breaking the wax seal. His eyes scanned the words, his face unreadable. A long silence stretched between them. Uriah shifted his weight slightly, waiting for the command. "You did not read this?" Joab asked suddenly. Uriah frowned. "No, my lord. The king's words are for you, not me." Joab nodded slowly, setting the letter down on the table. His fingers tapped against the parchment, his jaw tightening slightly. "You will lead the next charge," Joab said at last. Uriah straightened. "Against the city walls?" "Yes," Joab said, his voice carefully measured. Uriah did not question it. He had fought at the front lines before. It was where a warrior was meant to be. "I am ready," he said firmly. Joab exhaled. Something flickered in his eyes, something Uriah could not place. "Prepare your men. You will go at dawn." Uriah saluted, then turned to leave. He did not see the way Joab's hands clenched into fists. He did not know that Joab had just sent him to his death. That night, Uriah sat outside the tents, sharpening his blade. The fire crackled beside him, casting long shadows across the ground. The other soldiers talked in low voices, murmuring about the coming battle, about the risk of pushing so close to the enemy's walls. "It's madness," one soldier muttered. "They will rain arrows down on us before we even reach the gates." "Joab has his reasons," another said. Uriah listened, but he did not speak. He had been in battles far worse than this. Victory required sacrifice, and he was willing to pay that price. Still, a part of him wondered if he would ever see Bathsheba again. Would she pray for him tonight? Would she wait for his return, standing by the door as she always did? Would she weep if he did not come home? Uriah shook the thoughts from his mind. He could not afford to dwell on such things. Not now. Not when his king had given him a mission. He stood, sheathing his sword, lifting his eyes toward the darkened horizon. "Tomorrow," he murmured. "Tomorrow, we fight." He did not know that tomorrow he would die. The dawn sky was painted in deep shades of crimson and gold as Uriah stood at the front of his unit, his sword strapped securely at his side, his shield ready in his grasp. The city of Rabbah loomed ahead, its walls high and fortified, its gates closed like the jaws of a beast waiting to devour its prey. Behind him, his men stood ready, their expressions grim but determined. They trusted him. They had followed him into battle before, and they would follow him now. But this time, they did not know that they were leading their commander to his death. Joab had delivered the orders in the early hours of the morning. "You and your men will lead the assault," Joab had said, his voice firm, his expression unreadable. "Press hard against the city walls. Make the enemy focus on you." Uriah had nodded without question. He was a soldier. He did as he was commanded. And yet, something about this mission felt wrong. Pushing too close to the city walls was a death trap. The Ammonites would have the advantage, shooting arrows from above while his men were exposed below, but Joab was a skilled commander. If this was the strategy, then Uriah would trust him, would trust his king, would trust David. The horn sounded, signaling the charge. Uriah let out a deep breath, gripping his sword tighter. "Advance!" he commanded, leading his men forward. Their feet pounded against the earth as they rushed toward the enemy stronghold. The walls loomed higher with every step. Then the first arrow flew. It whistled through the air, striking one of his men beside him. The soldier cried out and collapsed, but the others pressed on. Another volley of arrows rained down. Shields lifted, metal clashed, men fell. Still, Uriah pushed forward. He could hear the shouts of the Ammonites from the walls, see the glint of their weapons as they prepared to defend their city. He raised his sword, preparing for the clash, and then, suddenly, he realized something was wrong. Where were the reinforcements? Where were Joab's other men? He risked a glance behind him, and his blood ran cold. The rest of the army had pulled back. They had left him and his men to face the enemy alone. His heart pounded as realization struck him like a blade to the chest. This was no strategy. This was a trap. "Hold the line!" Uriah shouted, trying to keep his men from breaking. But the enemy saw what had happened. The Ammonites knew they had been abandoned, and they pressed forward like wolves descending on a wounded prey. Uriah fought fiercely, his blade flashing as he struck down one soldier after another. His men fought valiantly beside him, refusing to fall easily. But there were too many, and one by one they fell. His sword grew heavier in his grasp. His arms ached, his breath came ragged. An arrow pierced his shoulder, but he did not fall. Another cut across his leg, but he gritted his teeth and kept fighting. But then, a sword found his side, and he staggered. The battlefield spun around him. He could hear the clash of weapons, the screams of the dying, but all he could think of was Bathsheba. Would she know what had happened? Would she grieve for him? Would she ever know the truth? His vision blurred. His knees buckled, and as he fell to the ground, the last thing he saw was the city walls towering above him, the walls that had become his grave. Back in Jerusalem, David sat in his palace, a cup of wine in his hand, waiting for the news. And when it came, delivered by a breathless messenger, he merely nodded. "Uriah the Hittite is dead." David exhaled slowly, setting his cup down. "Good," he murmured. The sun had barely risen over Jerusalem when the news reached Bathsheba. Uriah was dead. She had been in the courtyard, her hands trembling as she folded a piece of linen, when the messenger approached. His eyes did not meet hers, his voice flat as he delivered the words that would shatter her world. "Your husband fell in battle. He fought bravely, but he did not return." The linen slipped from her fingers. The world around her blurred, the voices of the servants fading into a dull hum. She could not breathe, could not move. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her stomach twisted violently. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, he was just here." But the messenger said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Uriah was gone, her husband, the man who had loved her without conditions, the man who had fought for a kingdom that betrayed him, the man who had trusted his king. And now he was buried beneath the dust of a battlefield, his blood soaking the very ground he had sworn to protect. Bathsheba fell to her knees, her hands clutching her stomach as sobs racked through her body. She had prayed for his return. She had prayed for mercy. But God had not answered, or had he? Her breath caught in her throat as another thought whispered through her mind, one that made her skin crawl. Had this been the plan all along? Had David known? Had he, her king, her lover, the father of her unborn child, sent Uriah to die? Her stomach twisted again, this time with sickness. She covered her mouth, swallowing down the bile that rose in her throat. If it was true, if David had done this, then what had she become? The palace was silent when David received the news. Joab's letter was brief. Uriah the Hittite has fallen in battle, as you commanded. David closed his eyes. The weight in his chest did not lift. He had expected relief, had hoped for it. But instead, all he felt was silence. The kind of silence that settled in the soul, the kind that could not be drowned out by music or feasts or even the warmth of a woman beside him. He had won. Uriah was gone. Bathsheba was his. And soon, no one would question the child she carried. He should have felt victorious. But the moment he looked at his own reflection in the polished bronze, all he saw was a man who had traded his honor for desire. The weight of blood was heavy, and it had stained him forever. Bathsheba mourned for Uriah. The days stretched on, filled with ceremonial weeping, with women whispering condolences, with empty words that did not bring him back. But when the mourning period ended, another summons came. The king has called for you. And she knew. Knew that she was not being called as a widow. She was being called as a wife, a queen. Bathsheba lifted her chin, her grief still fresh, still raw. Uriah was gone, and his death had written her future. There was no going back. So she walked forward, toward the palace, toward the man who had stolen everything from her, toward a life that she had never asked for. Bathsheba stood before the palace doors, her hands folded in front of her, her heart a tangle of grief and uncertainty. The weight of her widowhood had not yet left her, yet here she was, summoned once more, not as a grieving wife, but as a woman about to be taken as the king's own. She stepped forward, her sandals silent against the cool stone floor as she was led through the corridors of the palace. It felt different now. The last time she had been here, she had been brought in the secrecy of night, her presence hidden from the eyes of Jerusalem. Now, there was no hiding. David waited for her in his chambers. "Bathsheba," he murmured when she entered, his voice softer than she had expected. She did not bow, did not speak. Because what words were left to say? He had stolen her. He had stolen Uriah. He had stained her hands with blood that could never be washed away, and yet she had let him. David stepped forward, lifting a hand to her face, but she did not lean into his touch. "Come," he said quietly. "We will be married soon." Married to the man who had destroyed her home. To the man who had sent her husband to die. She swallowed, her throat tight, her heart hollow. This was her life now, and there was no escaping it. The wedding was quiet, not because the people did not whisper, not because the court did not murmur behind closed doors, but because David ensured that there was no room for scandal. Bathsheba became his wife. She bore his child, and soon her past as Uriah's widow began to fade from the lips of the people. The world moved forward, as if Uriah had never existed at all, but God had not forgotten. The prophet Nathan arrived one evening, his expression grim, his steps slow and deliberate as he entered the throne room. David greeted him with warmth, but Nathan did not smile. "My king, I have a story to tell." David gestured for him to continue. Nathan's voice was steady, filled with quiet weight. There were two men in a city. One was rich and had many flocks and herds. The other had nothing but a single lamb which he loved like a child. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup, slept in his arms. It was all he had. But one day the rich man had a visitor. Instead of taking a lamb from his own flock to prepare a meal, he took the poor man's lamb. He killed it and served it to his guest. David's brow furrowed. "Such a man deserves to die," he said, his voice filled with anger. "He must repay what he has stolen 4 times over." Nathan's eyes locked onto David's. "You are that man." Silence fell over the throne room. David's breath caught. "The Lord gave you everything," Nathan continued. "He made you king. He gave you victory, and yet you took Uriah's wife as your own. You murdered him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now the sword will never depart from your house." Bathsheba stood still, her blood turning to ice. Judgment had come. David's face paled. His lips parted, but no words came. And then he fell to his knees. "I have sinned against the Lord," he whispered. Nathan's gaze did not waver. "The Lord has taken away your sin. You will not die, but the child born to you will." Bathsheba gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Number. Not again. Not another loss, not another grave." She turned to David, waiting for him to speak, to argue, to plead, but he only bowed his head because he knew the price had to be paid. The child sickened soon after. David fasted. He refused food, refused comfort. He lay on the floor, weeping, praying, begging. But God did not change his judgment, and on the 7th day, the child died. Bathsheba could not weep. She had already lost everything. Now she simply stood in silence, watching as David rose from the ground, washed himself, and went into the house of the Lord to worship, because what else was there left to do? They had sinned, and they had been punished. But grace was not finished with them. Bathsheba bore another son, a child not born from scandal, but from restoration. His name was Solomon, the one who would rule after David, the one who would build the temple, the one through whom God would still fulfill his promises. And for the first time since it all began, Bathsheba allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had been chosen for something more than sorrow. Perhaps her story was not one of ruin, but of redemption. And so she looked at her son, at the future that now lay before him, and she whispered a prayer of hope. Because even after all that had been lost, something still remained. And God was not finished.